Let's talk books. Hi, I'm Geordane, and today I'll be talking about this book, Shake, Rattle, and Roll, by Adam David, Carl Joe Javier, Noel Pascual, and illustrated by Mervyn Malonzo. This is a horror book, obviously, you can see from the cover, based from the movie of the same title, actually the second installment of the movie. Well, I'm not sure why there isn't an adaptation for the first film, but the second film is the adaptation we're getting. Shake, Rattle, and Roll 2, the movie, was released in 1990, the year I was born, so obviously I couldn't have seen it in the cinema, and I haven't seen it anytime after. So my review for this book will only be based on my experience reading it. If you have seen Shake, Rattle, and Roll 2 and have read this book, do let me know in the comments what you thought about the adaptation, what you thought about the source material, and how faithful was the adaptation to the movie, or is the book an enhancement of the movie? All that kind in the comments down below. For my book reviews moving forward, I will be asking the help of my lovely roommate. Ta-da! Okay, so this is Dorian. Say hi, Dorian. He doesn't talk. He is my roommate, and for my book reviews, he will be providing us with the Dorian point system. So one Dorian would mean a terrible book. Don't buy it, don't bother thinking about it. Just be glad that someone read it and then told you about it, and then don't waste your time on it. And 5 Dorian would mean that definitely check it out. It's worth your time, money, effort, all that. So that's the Dorian point system. Now let's bring you back to the back, where you can comfortably sit and judge the book with me. Sound good? Let's start! If you're familiar with the movies, the book's format is a bit similar in terms of having multiple horror stories mixed or assembled into a feature-length film. This book, as thin as it is, has 3 unconnected horror stories. So judging from how thick the book is, you can expect that they're just short stories. Definitely no Stephen King here. Oh, and before jumping in, I have to say, spoiler alert. So the first story is called Pulot Kita sa Bahay ni Dr. Corpuz, written by Carl Joe Javier. The monster on the title page doesn't have anything to do with the monster or ghost in the story. This is Berting Bitay. I'm not sure if he's a fixture in the Shake, Rattle, and Roll franchise, but he's definitely here in the book. Just sort of like the Crypt Keeper in Tales of the Crypt Keeper, or Tales from the Crypt, the movie and the TV show. So this story involves a honeymooning couple on their visit to Baguio City, the city where I grew up in, work, and also occasionally hang out. So you better do this right, book. So this wedded couple spend the night in a secluded house in the more woody or more isolated parts of Baguio, which I suppose were more common then in the 90s. Now there's pretty much houses everywhere. So of course, after a moment, after steamy moments, for this couple, they begin to experience something weird, and basically your typical haunted story flow. I haven't got a problem with that. It's an entertaining story. I mean, it's a short story, so not much reinvention can be made there, especially from an adaptation of a movie in the 90s. So the first story, as you can see here, is given the comic book treatment. So it's fully illustrated by Mervyn Malonzo, and it's done really, really well. I've had a sneak peek of his popular webcomic, Tabo-oy, and I know he does his, I know he's done it fully illustrated. This time it's black and white, but his style is just as effective, fully colored and black and white. If anything, the black and white simply elevates the horrifying effects of his art. So Mervyn Malonzo's art is probably the best feature of this book. Especially for this story, because as I've said, the story is a bit simple, a bit predictable. We've heard it before, but so I guess the point of this, the more of the focus of this story is the art itself, or the scariness of the art. itself, not the plot, not the characters. All the characters are really kind of interesting. They're not annoying, at least, especially for a newlywed. What stands out to me from this story is the character design. Especially for the ghosts design. They're designed with pretty terrifying eyes. And until now, whenever my mind wanders, the ghosts from this story pop up in the back of my skull with those freaky tiny dot eyes. It's amazingly haunting. Apart from the standard storyline, the setting bothered me a bit. Like I said, being set in Baguio, a place I'm very familiar with, it's something that breaches a familiar territory for me. So I have to feel a bit guarded. How will they treat Baguio? And seeing how it was done in the book, I understand it's a short story, but Baguio in this story was a bit disappointing for me. Mostly because not much effort is put into the city's identity. Coming from someone who knows Baguio better than some, there definitely will be points where I think, really? That's it? That's all we're getting from the city where the story happens? To be fair, there were establishing shots, so from the very beginning of the story, there were Instagram photos of the bride posting the picture of the lion head, you know, very iconic. When you enter Baguio, you think of the lion head and all those things. And even an explicit mention of the name Baguio from the very first page of the story. And also, you know, establishing shots of woods, and also besides the establishing photos at the beginning, a couple of frames for the tourist site, so Wright Park and Burnham Park, the horse park and the lake park. And that's it. I know it's a short story, as I said, but really, I'm sorry, but that's all we're getting. So I suppose it's just meant to convey that this happened in a real place, and it could happen to anyone because this is a real place. And if you're not careful, you could end up like the couple at the end of this story. However, if we remove the name Baguio City, this city could have been anywhere else. There was no real reason for it to be set in Baguio City. Maybe the writers just thought, let's have it somewhere cold where most likely honeymooners go. Maybe that's the only connection to it, because honeymooners probably will go to Baguio City, and that's it. So one other thing that's pretty cool, but still pretty cool stylistically, is it was well done by the artist, but not really well done in terms of writing, and not the writer's fault, but probably the original sources. The villain is an abortionist. Like the setting, the villain could have existed anywhere else, and doesn't matter which city it would be, because everybody experiences abort. I mean, I'm not saying that nobody aborts in Baguio City. There probably are some. There's no real connection for the ghost's background and the setting. So the setting, once again, is proven more pointless, more useless to the story as it furthers along. As a lot of times I forget that this story was in Baguio City, and it's a very short story. You should probably have the feeling of Baguio from the very beginning to the end for a short story. You don't need to keep establishing the setting. But no. Maybe if we had to revamp the story to make the setting and the monster or the ghost or the main villain make sense together, if it was perhaps a Capre. The Capre isn't exactly a Cordilleran identity, or a Cordilleran is not a Cordilleran creature, but it would make much more sense for a Capre to exist in a place where there's a lot of trees. You've already established in the first shots that in a two-page illustration, that this place was filled with trees. So maybe, so you could have wrote that, and okay, maybe this is a premonition for creatures that lurk in the woods, like the Capre, or maybe you could have maybe a witch. At least a witch is much more prevalent in all cultures. A witch that gets people lost in the woods or gets lost in the city and then lures them back and then feeds on them or something. A generic story, but this is a haunted house story, a generic story, so it's not exactly a step up or step down. But it would relate to the setting better, but it doesn't. So I really like the art of this story, but the story itself has a lot of flaws that I couldn't ignore. But yeah, I understand that this is an adaptation from a 90s movie. There's already a lot of ignorant comments about the city of Baguio, the people of Baguio. So what more 27 years ago? That's no excuse, but still. Now, independent of the other two stories, I would still give Pulot Gata sa Bahay ni Dr. Corpuz. I don't know why it's called that. Maybe I missed it. I would still give the first story for Dorians. Mainly because it is a horror story. It's not supposed to be like very profound. I mean, horror stories can be that, but it doesn't need to be. All it needs to deliver is scare, scare, scare. And with Mervyn Malonzo's terrifying art, it definitely achieves that. I mean, the imagery is still branded in my mind. I mean, look at this cover. This is the cover is from the first story. So look at this cover. Tell me that does not bother you at all. It follows you into the room. Now let's continue to the second story. The second story is called Code Alert sa Room 666. It's not very subtle when it comes to its references. This one was written by Adam David, and this time it's a hospital horror story. Now it features the lead character, played in the movie by Joey Marquez. So off the bat, from the lead character, you could already tell that this is not just going to be a horror story. It's going to have comedy in it. Basically, Joey Marquez's character is a womanizing patient. It's funny because he's in a terrible situation. Anyway, he is a womanizing character. I keep mentioning that because it is relevant to the story. And who earns the ire of his doctor, who happens to be a witch. Not a witch doctor, a witch / doctor. A doctor witch, I think is a better term for him. Yes, that is a pretty interesting premise, approached differently because it has a comedic twist in it. I mean, as a comedy, without the horror elements, it could work, because it's about the womanizer getting what he deserves. And as a horror story, it could still work because it is a vengeful spirit or a vengeful entity story. So either one could work. Meshed together though, maybe for some people. I'm not a big fan of mixing comedy and horror, which is why I don't watch the sequels of popular horror movies like the Nightmare on Elm Street. I've only seen the first one. I've only seen the first Halloween. I've only seen the first Hellraiser. The sequels, I know, have a reputation of becoming campy or corny, and I'm not a fan of that mixture. I'm not a fan of that transformation. I'm not a fan of that genre. I enjoy comedy, but not with horror. Maybe if this story wasn't a part of this collection, because both the first and last stories were more serious when it comes to delivering horror or delivering scares. Maybe maybe I would have thought of it better. But considering which stories it's lumped with, I will have to rank it the lowest in this collection. It's not a bad story, but it's just the lowest one in my opinion. The part I liked best about it was that there was witchcraft involved, and I'm a fan of witchcraft in all its versions across cultures, across countries, and it has that. And the witch in this story performs voodoo, and that's pretty cool. But there were also other other rare moments where it's not in a lot of witchcraft related movies or shows. So that's pretty good. And it also had an interesting side character. I forgot her name, but she's this sort of sidekick of Joey Marquez's character, and she's kind of the voice of reason. And although it's pretty unclear if Joey Marquez's character really does develop or change at the end of the story, with the side character's presence, you could kind of feel that it would go to that direction. So even if it's a short story, there is a promise of character development hinged on this side character pushing the right buttons for the main character to stop his womanizing ways. So as I said earlier, I'm not a fan of the comedy and horror mix, so that definitely makes it one of the, from my perspective, one of the weaknesses of this book. And I understand that a lot of horror movies, modern and old horror movies, have moments of comedy, have moments of lightheartedness, and that's pretty important to lull the audience into a false sense of peace or good humor, and then bam, jump scare, jump scare, jump scare. But comedy happening alongside horror doesn't feel like a good mix for me. Of course, you might think differently. You might think it's one of the best things about a story or a horror story. Another thing is that unlike the first story, which was a full comic, the second story only has the cover, the title page, and one illustration in between the whole story. And I think I've given a lot of praises for Mervyn for just this book. But this illustration right here, it's 2 pages worth, and it's not the best illustration for the book. It's not the worst drawing ever, but it's not the best illustration in a collection, in this collection. Especially since it's sandwiched by one great illustration at the end, and then an entire comic book story at the beginning. The one illustration this story was spared, and it's not the best one. I mean, what did they call it? The jaguar, I think they called it, or panther. The wildcat in this illustration has flimsy legs. This is the witch character in this story, and she gets a creepy, I mean, just like the ghosts in the first comic, she gets a pretty creepy treatment, but that's all we're gonna get of her face. No other pages feature her appearance. So for this story alone, I would give it 3 Dorian. It's not a bad story, but it's not something I personally enjoy. Let's go to the next one. The third story is also not illustrated, except for an insert in the middle of the story and the cover page. It's called Pista sa Barrio Maliblib, and it's actually my favorite story from the 3. Okay, and I'm very glad that it happened at the last part of this book, so that I had something really good to end my experience with. The adaptation of this story was written by Noel Pascual. It's about a woman and her friend, and this friend invites the main character to visit her hometown. As it turns out, the whole town is a flesh-eating community of aswang, and the main character is on the menu. So, fun! It's a fun, short story on escapism. The best part, I believe, of the third story, the one that makes it my favorite, is the setting. Unlike the first story where it sets the place in Baguio and then utterly fails in delivering an identity that's specific to Baguio, this story sets it in a fictional place called Maliblib. It's described as pretty much a lot of the hot provinces that we are familiar with. Maybe you go there to visit your grandparents, you go there to vacation and all that. But bottom line is, the place feels very familiar, despite it being a fictional place. Because of that mixture of fiction, a fictional name, and very familiar details, the place is much more relatable, much more real than the setting of the first story. Now, one major problem I did notice was not the writer's fault. It's probably like layouting problems or encoding problems. I don't know, it's a technical problem. And I can't really fault anyone for it. So there's a pivotal moment in the story where the character's fate will finally be decided. Or at least it will be clear to the reader what will probably happen to this character in the end. And I was so immersed in the story, and then it cuts like abruptly, like for no reason at all. And then the next paragraph after that was like several scenes after. We already know what's gonna happen, but there's a moment, there's a big chunk of that moment that's missing. It's definitely not stylistic because it's so bad. Nobody could have done that on purpose, and nobody could have read that and then thought, it works. No, because it definitely doesn't work. There are several moments after that cut that would explain what happened to the next paragraph that I'm reading right now. But then I pressed on thinking, okay, maybe it'll work itself out like one of those non-linear stories where everything is a flashback, and then everything makes sense in the end. And then I was reading it, and the story still flows, and then it ends. And then at the end, like at the end paragraph where you know, okay, this story ends here, there are 3 paragraphs following that. And I was wondering, what are these doing here? And then I read the 3 paragraphs, and they were the paragraphs missing from the earlier moment of that book where the cut felt so awkward, felt so out of place. It obviously ruined the experience because that was a moment where it was clarified that, oh, this character is going to survive, this character is going to die in the end. And that part was not where it should be, and then it was at the end. I'm not sure what happened. I hope it's not like a conscious decision to do that, because it doesn't work at all. It definitely feels like a technical error, and I hope that is what it is. There probably are other flaws worth mentioning, but that was the most significant for me because it took away from the experience. And I can forgive flaws in stories as long as it doesn't break me off the experience or doesn't ruin the immersion, and this error or this thing definitely did. Considering that being the most problematic part of the story, it's definitely still an enjoyable read. I would give it 4 Dorian. I'm reserving the 5th Dorian because maybe it would have been better as a longer story, not a short story like this one. It's still pretty enjoyable. So in conclusion, the whole book, I did the math. The whole book, based on their individual Dorian score, gets 3.666. How appropriate. 3.666 Dorian skulls. Do I like it? Obviously, yes, I do. I mean, you can like something and then point out their mistakes. I enjoy stories on mythology, local mythology, foreign mythology. I enjoy those kinds of stories. I couldn't give it full 4 Dorian, even if I didn't go by the math and I just went by my feeling. Simply because it's still got flaws. Forgivable flaws sometimes. And a lot of those flaws hit me personally, especially the first one. I understand that those are personal preferences and you might feel differently, and that's what makes opinion great. And maybe if you were not from Baguio and then you've read the first one, you wouldn't have minded the disconnect between the place and the story. I'm still going on about it. Okay, should there be sequels for this book? Why not? I mean, the movies had sequels and people watched them. Maybe for the next books, if ever they decided to continue this one, they could make like the best of the best. They might choose the really good horror stories from all the other Shake, Rattle, and Rolls. There are like a dozen of them, aren't there? And also it provides an opportunity to feature artists like Mervyn. Maybe the next books will not be with him, maybe it will still be with him, but with other artists or completely new artists for each sequel of the book. I'm assuming that the sequels get made. It would definitely be a chance to come up with better writing. Maybe they would decide to completely rewrite some of the flaws from the original source material and all that kind of creative reinvention. Would I recommend it? Sure. It's a pretty fun book to read. If you're not overly critical about unique stories, it's still a fun experience. It's a B-horror adaptation, so you can set your expectation level to that. Even though it's no longer Halloween, if I read it now or if I read it when I first bought it in February, I would still have enjoyed it. So, 3.666 Dorian for my first review. Featuring Shake, Rattle, and Roll, written by, let's see if I remember, Adam David, Carl Joe Javier, and Noel Pascual, illustrated by Mervyn Malonzo. Thank you guys for watching this video of my review of the Shake, Rattle, and Roll book. Watch out for my next books. And if you have book recommendations which you feel like I should take a read and maybe even review, you could leave them in the comments. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up. But that's it for now. I'll see you on the next video.